pick up looking at some key figures and groups that were part of the civil rights movement. But before we crack into that, just a reminder of our objectives, looking at being able to describe the processes that led to the expansion of rights for African Americans, being able to describe methods that civil rights activists used to protest segregation, and then identify leaders and groups that influenced the civil rights movement. So we're going to pick up by looking at some key figures and groups. Some of them you know, some of them you might not. The first is Martin Luther King Jr. Obviously, everyone knows who Martin Luther King Jr. is. He was part of a group called the SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and they supported nonviolent resistance. His sort of counterpart is Malcolm X, who was a member of a group that was called the Organization of Afro-American Unity, and he promoted Black nationalism, the idea that there ought to be a nation for Black people, Afro-Americans, or the idea that self-defense and human rights are something that should be inherent in the system. He was often in opposition with Martin Luther King, and we're going to look a little bit more at that. They shared many values, but their methods were rather different. Medgar Evers, he was the founder of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored Peoples, the NAACP. We talked about a little bit the other day when we talked about Brown versus the Board of Education. The Little Rock Nine we talked about the other day integrated their all-white high school in 1957. And then Linda Brown was the student involved in Brown v. Board of Education. Some other groups, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, they're called SNCC, SNCC. They will begin with a focus on voter registration, and they're going to work really hard to try to register more voters of color, especially throughout the South, where voter intimidation was the norm, and there were other means of disenfranchising Black voters, including using poll taxes or grandfather clauses. The other would be Congress on Racial Equality, CORE, and they supported nonviolent resistance to segregation. So the big four groups are SNCC, the SCLC, CORE, and the NAACP. I'm really interested in how people can share the same ideas, but have very different methods of going about it. So we're going to look at Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. Martin Luther King was a Southern Baptist minister. He was educated in the North. Malcolm X was a Northerner who converted to Islam. So they have very different religious ideologies, but they still have a lot in common. But their methods are going to be very different. Malcolm X, as you can see here, confrontational protest. Malcolm X did not necessarily believe in using only nonviolent means, whereas Martin Luther King, following in the footsteps of Gandhi, believed in nonviolent resistance. And he also collaborated and worked alongside whites who were working toward the same goals. Where Malcolm X, as a Black nationalist, believed that the civil rights movement should be a Black movement only and should only be for the betterment of that group. He is going to look more at how the Jim Crow laws function and use direct methods to challenge them. So I have some quotes here, and they're side by side. I want you to pause me, take a couple of minutes and read them. They are super dense, and they are really powerful in terms of the language that they use. So this one is about violence. And I'm going to pick out a couple things. So pause me now and read it. Unpause. Now that you've read it, I want you to take a look at a couple of different places. So here, this is a really interesting argument. We assert that in those areas where the government is either unable or unwilling to protect the lives and property of our people, that our people are within their rights to protect themselves by whatever means necessary. This becomes kind of a catchphrase that's associated with Malcolm X, by any means necessary, to further the goals of the civil rights movement by any means necessary. Where Martin Luther King is going to continually go back to saying that violence multiplies violence. Darkness cannot drive out darkness, only light can do that. So they have very different tone in the way that they are writing. One of the things that's particularly interesting about Malcolm X and what he's saying here is that, for those of you who are interested in the 60s particularly, the Black Panther movement actually kind of comes out of this. They start off as gun rights advocates. They have obviously a very interesting backstory before they became the group that people are a little bit more familiar with. It is the duty of every African American community throughout this country to protect its people against mass murderers, bombers, lynchers, floggers, brutalizers, and exploiters. So he's saying here that it's not law enforcement's job. In fact, Malcolm X would say you can't trust law enforcement because law enforcement doesn't work for us. It works for someone else. So this idea of Black nationalism has to do with focusing on your own community, taking care of your community from within, where King is more about collaboration and working alongside. The next one is about integration. This looks like I've edited it. I didn't. It was cut off onto a different page, and there were some endnotes in between, so I just cut them out. Take a look, pause, and read it now. Unpause. So here, this is actually from, I think you'll recognize the I Have a Dream speech about integration, that I have a dream that one day in Georgia, sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will sit down together at the table of brotherhood, let freedom ring, and then he kind of notes all of these different people, different places. Malcolm X, on the other hand, he's going to advocate for something a little bit different. All we're saying now is, since we're already divided, the least the government can do is let us control the areas where we live. Let the white people control theirs, let us control ours. That's all we're saying. So he's not really pushing here for integration. He's not opposed to segregation as long as it's a community that is creating it. And then after we control our society, then we can work together. Don't let us try and mix with each other, because every time that mixture takes place, we find that the Black man is the low man on the totem pole. So here's a key idea. Martin Luther King and Malcolm X met once and only once. King outlives Malcolm X. Malcolm X is killed in the street. And this is something that's kind of debated as to why. That's something you can look a little bit more into. But he was going to be breaking with the group that he was a part of, and there was infighting within his group. Change starts with forcing people to pay attention. Activists, people who want to enact change, used a variety of strategies. Martin Luther King advocates nonviolence, peaceful methods to call attention to the problem and to create pressure on the government to change it. So to try to force the government to pass laws to change the way that things are. Malcolm X is not looking to work from within the government. He's looking to work from outside the government and to make changes as a community. And he's not opposed necessarily to using violence, where Martin Luther King is. And that's why the way that you hear people talk about King or Malcolm X are very different. Malcolm X was not born Malcolm X. He was born Malcolm Little, but he gave up his last name and took X as a political statement that his name had been given to him by a system of slavery. So here are some tactics. Marches are one. They're probably the one that you're most familiar with. Large groups of protesters take to the streets. The next is a form of direct action. It is a sit-in. That's what you see here on the right-hand side. Sit-ins became very common, and they were a way to force integration in businesses or public areas that refuse to integrate. So what you see here is a lunch counter that was segregated. And you can see these three people are sitting in a place where they're not supposed to sit in. Blacks would sit at white-only areas and wait to be served. When they would not, when they were refused service, they would refuse to leave until they were served. So by sitting there, they were taking up the spot of a paying customer, disrupting the business, but often they faced really violent backlash from within the community. Here you see that food has been thrown on them, and there's instances where they are beaten as well. And we'll actually come back to that. Boycott is another one, very common still today. Avoid purchasing a product or service that's discriminatory, and then using court cases like Brown versus Board of Education. There are some changes in the law that we didn't look at the other day. So here's one. It's the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Before Kennedy dies in 1963, he looks to create integration in facilities. So again, this goes back to Plessy versus Ferguson. Hotels, restaurants, theaters, retail stores, and other establishments, and greater protection of voting rights. This is pushed through by President Johnson the next year after Kennedy's assassination with great support of the American people. Poll taxes become illegal. That's forcing people to pay to get access to a ballot by virtue of having elections the way that we do. You can't do that. And so that becomes codified in the Constitution with the 24th Amendment. And then the last is the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which prohibits any restriction on the right to vote, including poll tests. And I'll post one of those so you can take a look at it. Voter intimidation, any of those means that had become really sadly very common throughout the South. There's opposition. Okay, not everyone is necessarily going to approve. There is a group called Dixiecrats. Remember that the South was called Dixie. There's a lot of songs that involve that. Work to keep racial segregation and Jim Crow laws the norm in the South. There were groups that were white citizen councils where within their town they would push for segregation. The Ku Klux Klan in its sort of third embodiment comes about during this period. And the way that we tend to think about the Klan today is much more the Klan of the 1950s and 60s than it is when we last were talking about them. They are responsible for acts of violence and instilling terror in African Americans and white people who are working with them, or any people of color who are working alongside. And the goal is to make speaking out or any act of activism a dangerous activity. The goal is to intimidate people. But public support begins to build, in part starting with someone that I know that you know, Rosa Parks. December 1st, 1955, she's arrested for refusing to give up her seat on a bus, right? Bus desegregation becomes something that will come to pass as a result. The Greensboro, here, the lunch counter sit-ins. Greensboro, North Carolina was a very segregated area. 4 black college students sit, they order a coffee at a whites-only lunch counter. And then nonviolent sit-ins will spread, and SNCC will grow out of the sit-in movement. So here you see like food being thrown, right? But here this man has been beaten. He's being forcibly removed from the lunch counter. And there's some really great film examples of this as well. If you've seen the movie The Butler, which I don't know that that's really a popular movie these days, it does a really excellent job of looking at the reality of a lunch counter sit-in. And they were trained and prepared for what they might face. The Freedom Rides come out of looking to increase voter registration. This is before the Voting Rights Act of 1964 and 1965. So the Congress for Racial Equality, CORE, they organize these groups. What they're doing is trying to integrate interstate buses, and many of them are also the whites, at least, the white students, they are trying to drum up voter support as well. When leaving Anniston, Alabama, when the driver tried to leave the station, the tires were slashed by the Klan, and there's a mob that forces the bus to stop. The bus is firebombed. The riders are trapped inside. The riders were beaten as they finally escaped the bus, and there were, fortunately, highway patrol on hand by that point to prevent them from being taken by the Klan, where they would have likely been lynched. And it's unclear, when you're looking at number 2, when the mob retreats, either from the exploding fuel tank or armed undercover state investigator. And I have an image here of what the bus looked like. I was very fortunate to go to the Civil Rights Museum, which is in Memphis, Tennessee. And I'll post some pictures from that trip. But this bus is actually in the museum. And it's very scary to see what it looks like, and that other human beings would try to trap other human beings inside a bus and kill them. By 1963, we have kind of a major surge in public support. Martin Luther King delivers the I Have a Dream speech at the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. And this is as a part of the March on Washington, which involves 250,000 people gathering on the National Mall. NAACP and other civil rights groups are involved, and this really takes the issue to the mainstream in a whole new way. The next key event would be the marches in Selma, Alabama. This is the Edmund Pettus Bridge, very famous. They did not a reenactment, but a commemoration of this march a couple years ago, and you'll see very similar pictures, which is really cool. Very similar pictures to these as well, very cool. Dr. King in the middle. 600 marchers who are looking to support voting rights legislation, an end to intimidation at the polls. They're stopped and assaulted by police officers, actually, and other people on the outskirts of the city, which we see somewhat here. So Martin Luther King leads a second march. This is from the second march. And they will march from Selma to Montgomery, both in Alabama. I have some images here for you of some of that treatment. So officers would use their dogs to attack protesters, use fire hoses. I don't know that any of that would necessarily be new information. I'm sure that's something you've learned before. But by 1964, more people approved of the Civil Rights Act than disapproved. So I mean, I guess that's a good sign, but 30% is still an alarming percent that believes that people of color don't deserve the same voting rights as white people. So I'm going to leave it here, but when I post these, I'm going to put some links in here. This is a lesson that I've done before, looking at music and its role within the civil rights movement. And I have some information here. I'll put some links in it. We Shall Overcome becomes kind of like the hallmark song, but there's a number of other groups and other songs that come out of this, and R&B is really like hitting its stride during this point. R&B and what's going to become rock and roll, the way that we understand it. So they're going to use music to tell a story, to bring people together. Soul music. So I'll put some links in here if it's something that you're interested in. It'll be here for you. These are already linked. This is my favorite song. So you'll see some of that in the slides. So next time I see you, I'm going to pick up here, and you guys are going to have the opportunity in your Unit 13 assessment. You're going to choose an issue that you think is important today for you. You are the young people, and try to draw some connections to the roots of that movement or that issue in the 1950s, 60s, or 70s. So tomorrow you're going to hear from me. We're going to kind of pause this, and we're going to look at the Berkeley Free Speech Movement, which is one of my favorite historical events, and I'm super excited to share it with you. And then we'll move on to these examples.